Welcome, everyone. My name is Megan John, Director of Advocacy and Engagement for the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition. I thank you all for joining today and especially for your interest in advocating for affordable housing at such a critical time. Before we get started, I have just a couple logistics. First off, all participants on this webinar are muted, but we encourage you all to ask questions throughout the hour by using the chat function at the side of your screen. Additionally, this webinar is being recorded, and later today we'll be sending you all the webinar recording along with slides and additional resources about the AHCIA. So with that, I am pleased to introduce Emily Kotick, Executive Director of the AHTCC, to get us started.
Great, well, thank you, Megan, and welcome to our webinar on advocating for the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. This legislation is the Tax Credit Coalition's top priority and something we've been working for years to develop, build support for, modify as needed, and of course, get as much as we can across the finish line. So we're thrilled to have gotten several pieces from this bill enacted into law already, including the minimum 4% housing credit rate that we got done at the end of last year, as well as the 12.5% cap increase and income averaging in 2018. And we're excited to advocate for the rest of the bill this year, especially with a very real opportunity to get quite a bit done for the housing credit as part of infrastructure legislation. So joining us today, we have Matt Josephs from LISC, who's the president of the Tax Credit Coalition Board of Directors. We have Ryan Sofredo from Redstone Equity Partners, who's our legislative committee chair, Dudley Benoit from Alliant Capital, who is our marketing committee chair, Peter Lawrence from Novogradac and Company, and Melissa Francis from Ben Strategies, who works with us on government affairs. And before we jump in, I just wanted to say a bit more about who we are for those of you who are new to the Tax Credit Coalition. You can go to the next slide, thank you. So we are a membership organization of 200 organizations and businesses that represent the full spectrum of the affordable housing industry, including both nonprofit and for-profit developers, syndicators, investors, state agencies, attorneys, and accountants. Collectively, our members have developed or financed well over half of all affordable housing homes that use the housing credit. So when we make recommendations to Congress, we're able to send a really powerful message by speaking with one voice. There's a lot of ways for our members to get involved in our advocacy and learn more about issues impacting the housing credit. So for those of you who are not members, please reach out to learn more. We'd love to get you involved. So as for the agenda for today's webinar, we're going to be discussing what the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act is, how it came together, what's new this year, how we can potentially get it across the finish line, or at least some key pieces of it, what some of those key pieces are, and then how you can advocate for it and the resources that you can use. We will be taking questions, so feel free to ask them throughout using the chat box. Our goal is really that you come away from this webinar feeling excited about the AHCIA and its prospects and comfortable reaching out to congressional offices or even just your colleagues to enlist them in our efforts. So with that, I will turn it over to our board president, Matt Josephs of LISC, to give us a quick history of the AHCIA.
Great, thank you, Emily. You can hear me, Emily?
Yep.
Okay, great. So yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Happy to be on the part of this conversation. We do want to start with kind of a brief history. How did we get here with the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act? Some wins we've gotten along the way, some pieces that we've been able to successfully implement along the way too. So really the first comprehensive housing credit legislation, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, kind of came together after 2015. Prior to that, our major asks were to make get a permanent fix for the 9% floors and the 4% floors as part of a separate legislation, and we got the permanent 9% fix in 2015. And then after that effort, you know, some of our leading sponsors on the Hill said, "What else can we do? What do you need?" So it started conversations about, well, what if we're going to make some more comprehensive reforms and improvements to the program? So in 2016 marked the first year where we introduced what came to be known as the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, with Senator Maria Cantwell from Washington as our primary sponsor, alongside the then chair of the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah. So that was in 2016 where we first saw this bill that had like a couple of dozen provisions in it to really improve and enhance the program. It was reintroduced in 2017 at the start of the next Congress, again with the same sponsors on the Senate side, but for the first time it was introduced in the House. There was a version in the House introduced, and our champions then, or the key sponsors, were Pat Tiberi and then and Richie Neal, who went on to become the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. They were the two champions that introduced this legislation in 2017. Flashing forward, we had gotten increments of the bill passed into law. The most notable, it wasn't the full ask, but we had requested a 50% increase in the 9% credit formula to the states, and we kind of got a down payment on that. A temporary 12.5% cap increase that was for 4 years, and that actually expires this year, and also the provision for income averaging, which has been kind of more in the news lately now that IRS has put out some proposed rules around this. But those were provisions that were from the original AHCIA that were kind of that were implemented separately through other legislation. Similarly, we had the 4% floor fix was also picked up at the end of last year. So this is kind of what you sometimes, it's not uncommon to see. You have broad legislation where you're trying to get a lot of different things done, and then pieces get picked up here and there. So this is not at all uncommon, but obviously our goal is to get the entirety of AHCIA enacted. So that brings us to 2021, and we are fortunate now that we can take out some of the provisions because they've already been enacted, and we also have a really promising, I think, new legislative landscape for us. We have, first off, an administration that has been very active about saying what their support, their commitments to affordable housing has been a part of their DNA, and they're really committed to this. So that's going to be very helpful. We also have an opportunity because major infrastructure legislation could be moving through Congress, and the administration already committed to doing $213 billion more for affordable housing. A large piece of that, we think, would be their commitments to the low-income housing tax credit. So this is great. We have now the interest in pursuing this, the vehicles with an infrastructure bill, and also we can really point to the growing need. Unfortunately, that's the unfortunate part of the equation, is that the need for affordable housing continues to grow, to expand significantly. So we can make our case, and also with the fixed to the 4% now, you really do see some more need for other subsidies for affordable housing as well. So as far as our key sponsors for this coming year, continues to be Senator Cantwell and Senator Young as the leads. They were in the leads in the last session as well. We now have a second co-lead that's new, Senator Portman, who's been a champion of the credit, but he's now stepping in since Senator Isaacson has retired to be the co-lead there, and also Senator Wyden. Now the chairman of the Finance Committee is our second lead for the Senate bill. So not a bad set of leads to have there. On the House side, Suzanne Delbene continues to be the main lead. She took over when Richie Neal became the chairman of the committee. She's joined by Don Beyer from Virginia on the Democrat side, and Jackie Walorski is the lead again. She had stepped in when Kenny Marchant had retired, and for the first time now, Brad Winstrup from around the Cincinnati area of Ohio is going to be stepping up as the second co-lead for the Republican side. So again, all Ways and Means, very strong leads for us, both the House and the Senate. And I think this kind of strong bipartisan support is really going to serve us well as we push to get the entirety of the legislation approved. So with that, I think Melissa is next in line to talk about those prospects.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. Yes, infrastructure legislation could absolutely serve as a vehicle for the AHCIA provisions. President Biden's administration, as Matt suggested, already calls for a marked increase in resources available through the low-income housing tax credit and other housing incentives. We will hear more details from the president next week when he gives his 100th day joint address to Congress. The House has also begun its work building from the Moving Forward Act of 2020 that passed the House last year, including a dozen housing credit provisions. We expect to see action in the House starting later in May, potentially June. And Speaker Pelosi has suggested that House passage could be by the 4th of July recess. But that deadline could potentially slip into later this summer, early fall, which would then lead to final passage of an infrastructure package into mid-fall this year. Something, though, must happen on infrastructure by September 30th. At the very least, they need to reauthorize the highway program. So we will see something happen by September 30th. The real question here, though, is how many vehicles will there be? And will any of them be bipartisan? The Biden administration is attempting to find some path forward to gather Republican support on infrastructure. So we could see a more limited bipartisan package that comes first, and then a follow-on package using budget reconciliation rules, that process that only requires a 51 vote for Senate passage to get to enactment. But if you use that process, though, the vehicle can be constrained by what can actually get in it for the various with the various reconciliation rules. There are actually multiple reconciliation vehicles that the Democrats might be able to use, and this typically turns into more of a partisan process when this vehicle is used, due to the fact that only 51 votes are needed and the very, very narrow margins in the Senate. These vehicles could absolutely serve as provisions for housing credit provisions to make their way to enactment. There could also be, outside of the infrastructure conversation, a year-end tax bill. There will be tax provisions, including the expiration of the 12.5 housing credit allocation increase, 12.5% housing credit allocation expires at the end of this year. And there could be a bill to extend all of those annual tax provisions that expire. All of that to say, there may be multiple vehicles for housing credit provisions, but infrastructure talks are happening now, and we must build the bipartisan co-sponsorship back up for the AHCIA as quickly as possible, and that's where you all come in. Now I'll turn it over to Ryan to give an overview of what's in the AHCIA.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to see so many collared shirts and blazers on a Zoom call, and I'm really excited about the reintroduction of this critical legislation to help address our nation's growing affordable housing crisis. We've mentioned before that the AHCIA is bipartisan, but it really is worth repeating. Bipartisan, bipartisan, bipartisan. You get the gist. We do have a very strong and bipartisan, once more for good measure, set of original co-sponsors, as Matt described, and we're working quickly to add more. But I also think it's important to note where we are coming from. In the last Congress, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act secured the co-sponsorship of more than half of the U.S. House of Representatives from both sides of the aisle, and more than 40 members of the U.S. Senate. Think about those numbers for a second. In tranquil and unified times, those are impressive numbers. In the current polarized political climate we find ourselves in, this level of bipartisan support for a bill containing 2+ dozen provisions is unheard of. And while there are a lot of provisions in this bill, they do fall into a few main categories that will make it a little easier to talk about. First and foremost, the bill would expand our ability to build and preserve affordable housing. There are several key provisions that propel us towards producing more than 2 million additional affordable homes, which we'll go through in a minute. Second, there are provisions to help the housing credit do more to serve hard to reach areas and populations like rural and Native American communities, as well as extremely low-income tenants. Third, there are several provisions intended to specifically help facilitate the preservation of existing affordable housing and to remove unnecessary red tape and barriers. Fourth, considering the growing demand for private activity bond financing, which of course generates 4% housing credits and equity, there are provisions targeted toward bond finance properties. Finally, there are a number of provisions that would help to streamline the housing credit program, make it more efficient, and promote good governance. We'll go through these in a minute, but first wanted to highlight some of the key changes in this year's version of the bill relative to the last go-round. While most of the AHCIA is the same as the previous version, there are a few important changes this year. the most significant of which, and impactful, is the new provision which would lower the 50% test bond financing threshold to 25%, thereby helping developments access 4% credits with only half of the required tax-exempt bond financing. This is huge for states that are volume cap constrained, but also helps states that don't fall into that category by eliminating an unnecessary barrier and complexity to securing project financing. Since this is a new proposal and a bit nuanced and complex, we have a handout explaining this provision that should be located under the handout section of your sidebar. We'll also circulate this after the webinar as well. There's also the same proposal as before to increase the allotment of 9% housing credits by 50%, but this time it would phase in over 2 years instead of over 5. There are also some smaller tweaks to the bill. One would expand the student rule provision to make some formerly homeless youth and victims of human trafficking are exempted from the prohibition in having full-time students live in housing credit properties. Another change would update the casualty loss provision to allow for greater than 25-month rebuilding period following a natural disaster by extending that timeline out to 37 months. This is something that became apparent following the many recent unfortunate natural disasters, including the California wildfires. There are also 2 provisions that have been removed. The 4% fixed provision, since of course that was signed into law late last year, and a provision impacting the right of first refusal, which was removed because of a lack of consensus on this provision among industry stakeholders. Under the handout section of the webinar, there's also a summary document listing all of the changes in the bill for anyone that's interested. With that, I'll turn it over to Peter to discuss the provisions with the greatest impact in terms of affordable housing production and Novogradac and Company's estimates of what that impact will be. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. As Ryan mentioned, one of the key changes from last year's legislation is the 50% allocation increase for the 9% side of the program. It's phasing in over 2 years instead of 5 years. This is similar to the House infrastructure bill from last year that passed and would provide a increase among all states in both the per capita and the small state minimum amounts that each state would be eligible for. The new provision, again, just to say it again, would be to lower the financed by threshold for private activity bond, tax-exempt bond financed properties from 50% to 25%. And as Ryan mentioned, we do have a handout on this, but I do want to just step back and say this is really important because this helps provide much greater efficiency in the use of bond resources. Instead of, to a large extent, developers having to issue and receive a 50% bond allocation and refinancing and paying off much of those bonds, if not all of those bonds, after the construction financing, and then having a much smaller permanent debt level, this provision would right-size the bond allocation for the needs of the property and enable bond cap to generate more 4% credits for more developments. And then there are 3 main basis boost provisions that would help make many more types of bond properties financially feasible and generate more tax credit equity. One would extend the policy that exists under current law for states to provide a discretionary boost to 9% developments to bond finance properties. A second would to classify rural areas, that's being non-metro counties plus rural areas of metro counties that are eligible for USDA's rural housing programs to receive a 30% basis boost. And finally, given the challenges of development in Native American areas, would extend that 30% basis boost availability for bond finance properties in Native American areas as well. If you go to the next slide, what we have determined in estimating these major ones, and there are other provisions that also have a unit financing impact as well, but these are the lion's share of the ones that would help production and preservation of affordable rental housing. And that is, we estimate that up to nearly 1.5 million affordable rental homes could be financed using private activity bonds. And the only caveat I'll add to that estimate there is we do assume that all of the freed bond cap going from a 50% test threshold to 25% threshold would be used for rental housing, and that there is sufficient gap financing available in the state to maximize the unit production and preservation. And then the next estimate we have on the 9% allocation increase, we estimate that just under 300,000 units would be financed with that increase. And then the combination of all three of the main 30% basis boost provisions for the state discretionary, rural, and Native American, collectively all three of those we estimate would finance 222,000 units. And when you add them all together, that's more than 2 million affordable rental homes, which is really, I think, an impressive total that Congress will appreciate given the tremendous affordable rental housing crisis out there and how the housing credit can be a major solution there. So I'll turn it over to Emily to talk about the rest of the provisions.
Great, well, thank you, Peter. As you can see, the bill has an even bigger estimated impact this year, which is appropriate given the growing need. And we're not going to go through the other 24 or so provisions in the bill today in detail, but we did at least want to go through some of the categories that the provisions fall into and highlight some of the key provisions within those categories. So there are several other provisions that have a really big impact and have been especially helpful in helping us build support for the bill and bipartisan support for the bill, which are the provisions that help the housing credit serve hard to reach areas and populations. So in addition to the boosts that Peter mentioned, which include the 30% basis boost for rural and native areas, there's another 50% basis boost for properties serving extremely low income tenants, which can help serve formerly homeless veterans and other special needs populations and can really make the difference in whether some of these types of developments are possible or not. There's also a handful of other provisions outside of these basis boosts that also specifically help rural and native communities as well as veterans. And then there's several provisions to encourage housing credit development in high opportunity areas. And that includes expanding the population cap on difficult development areas, so more developments in high cost areas can qualify for that basis boost. There's a provision that would eliminate local approval and contribution requirements to help keep NIMBY opposition from blocking developments that need to move forward. And then there's also a proposal to help ensure that when housing credit developments are in lower income areas, that they contribute to a concerted community revitalization effort. So on the next slide, you'll see there's also several provisions that help facilitate the preservation of existing affordable housing. And this includes proposals like allowing the housing credit to cover the cost of tenant relocation if needed as part of redevelopment, providing more flexibility around the incomes of existing tenants when a development needs to be refinanced, and allowing for longer rebuilding periods if needed after disasters or other casualty losses to the development. There's also a couple of other provisions that help the bond finance side of the program. In addition to the proposals that we talked about to lower the 50% test to 25%, which is really the biggest impact in this area, there's two other provisions that are also helpful. So one would allow the states to provide a discretionary 30% basis boost for bond finance properties, the way that states can already allocate that boost for properties on the 9% side. And then there's also an expansion of multifamily bond recycling, which would also free up more bond resources and is especially important in bond cap constrained states. And finally, we wanted to highlight a few provisions that just help with streamlining the program, including improving the student rule, better aligning the housing credit with the Violence Against Women Act, making sure cost reasonableness is a factor that states consider when they award credits, and then making the housing credit easier to pair with energy tax incentives. So we're happy to answer questions about any of these or go more in depth. Again, the resources are in your handout sidebar and we'll send them around as well. But we at least wanted to provide an overview of some of the provisions that we end up discussing the most when we talk about the bill with congressional offices. But though we did just run through a lot of specifics, we want to make sure everyone knows you do not need to go through all of these provisions when you advocate for the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. So instead, you can just focus on some of the key points, provide some of the resources that we're sharing as background materials, or even just put congressional staff in touch with us and our team to follow up. So what we would ask you to do, if you do have the opportunity to meet with congressional offices, we want to just try to get across a few key points. So one is just that the housing credit is our primary tool for financing affordable housing. It's a public-private partnership with a 30-plus year history of success, and it's already financed more than 3.5 million homes. But the need for affordable housing, as we all know, was great even before the pandemic and has only grown since then. And there's now 10.5 million renter households in need of affordable housing, including veterans, seniors, essential workers, homeless, working families, people with disabilities. And we want to get across that, again, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act is a bipartisan solution and would make a meaningful dent in this crisis. As Peter explained, it could finance more than 2 million more affordable homes than otherwise possible over the next 10 years and create more than 3 million jobs. We encourage you to really also share any local angle you have. There's state-specific information and there's district-specific information. And if you can convey these points, make the local connection and just share the bill materials with members of Congress or their staff, that's really all that's required to advocate for this bill. So with that, I will turn it over to Melissa to discuss some of the specific approaches we take with congressional offices based on whether or not they've supported the bill in the past.
Thank you, Emily. Yes, for members that have already co-sponsored the AHCIA, getting them back on often can be just a matter of making the request. If you aren't sure if a member has co-sponsored before, though, when we send around the slide deck after the webinar, you can click the links here to check if they were co-sponsors of last year's bills. If they did sponsor, first and foremost, please thank them and let them know we're grateful for the recent enactment of the 4% rate. It was a very important first step. But we need to let them know that the rest of the AHCIA is even more important now as the crisis has grown, which is why this year's version has even greater impact with the changes we discussed, and we hope that they can support this effort again. Specifically ask, please co-sponsor this legislation again. For those who are new or just didn't sign on in the past, take the opportunity to educate them about the need for the housing credit and the AHCIA, and that need is growing. Make the case as local as possible. Provide specific examples of housing credit impact in their areas. As you know, as politics are all local, and that is how we can really make the case and demonstrate impact to these members of Congress. It's also, as was said earlier, very helpful to note how broad the bipartisan support is for this legislation. It often makes members more inclined to sign on if they can see how well vetted the bill is by their colleagues. While we're still early in the process this year, you can always point to the bipartisan support that we found last year, including more than half of the House and more than 40 senators as co-sponsors. Again, most importantly, ask for these members to co-sponsor this important legislation. While we're encouraging any member of Congress to sign on, the ones we are primarily focused on are those on key committees who will be especially influential in developing infrastructure, economic recovery, and other legislation that could advance housing credit priorities. We're going to quickly go through these next slides that highlight those key committees. Please note the italicized names, all previous co-sponsors of the AHCIA. First up, the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee, and then on the next slide. And those are the committees that handle the tax issues in Congress. And then the next two slides, which you can keep changing, thank you, the Senate Banking Committee and the House Financial Services Committee, which handle other housing issues. We will share the list of these members in our slides after the webinar, and if you have any connection to any of these members, we encourage you to reach out to them directly, or you can always contact the AHTCC and we can help you with that outreach. Now I'll turn it over to Dudley to discuss some of the resources that you too can use in your advocacy.
Thanks, Melissa. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for making the time for us today. As you know, the coalition and our partners in the Action Campaign put together a great set of materials on the bill. Some that keep it high level for members of Congress or staff who just want a quick snapshot of the issues, and some that goes much more in deeper detail for staffers who really want to dive into the bill and learn the details. Overall, we just want to keep reminding folks that the outreach and reaching out to our congressional partners is key, and this is where you could play a key role in helping us achieve that. I encourage you to check out 2 new web pages we've created, one about the Credit Improvement Act specifically, and one that has more about how to advocate for it. We also have here a high-level summary of the bill with the key messages we've discussed, as well as a handout just on the proposal to lower the 50% test, since that is a new proposal and we are expecting to get more questions on it. We also have a handout showing how the Tax Credit Improvement Act fits into the infrastructure conversation, since that is most likely the vehicle for advancement. And we provide a lot of information about why housing is an essential part of infrastructure and why the Improvement Act is specifically needed. These 3 resources are also in the handout section of your sidebar here today. Next slide, please. We also have some of the basics about the bill, including a detailed section-by-section bill summary, an explanation of each change to the bill since the prior version, which is especially helpful for members of Congress who have signed on to the bill in the past, state and local data, and of course, the bill text. We also encourage you to check back at these co-sponsor lists so you can see if members have signed on and how the list is growing. For example, it's often helpful to show a member from Ohio if there are several other members of Congress from Ohio who have also signed on. You'll also be able to access all of these links through the PowerPoint when we share it after the webinar. We hope that you find these helpful in your advocacy, and please always feel free to let our team know if there's other information or another format that would be useful, and we can do our best to help. With that, I'll turn it over to Megan to talk about some of the other ways the Tax Credit Coalition can support your advocacy.
Thank you so much, Dudley. One of the best ways that we can build support for the housing credit is by sharing your work with members of Congress and their staff through property events and milestones. This engagement can come in a number of forms. It may be flagging your closings, inviting them to attend your groundbreakings or your grand openings, or taking them on socially distant or virtual property tours. But the number one thing to remember is that members of Congress and their staff do want to know what's going on in their states and districts, and they want to be a part of it. So AHCC members should feel free to reach out to us if you have property events coming up and you'd like assistance involving congressional offices. We can help make a connection for you, and we can assist with other aspects of the event as well, such as housing credit related talking points for speakers. Of course, another great way to advocate is through meetings. And though we haven't been able to hold our in-person advocacy events in far too long, we will be hosting a virtual fly-in on the week of May 10th for AHCC members. We'll be sharing registration after this webinar, but if you aren't able to attend, please note that we're also happy to help coordinate meetings outside of our virtual and hopefully soon in-person fly-ins as well. Now, the most common way to advocate is by email, and we're here to help with that as well. AHCC members can contact me for a template to help you start and personalize your emails, as well as access to the appropriate congressional staff contact information. And lastly, it's very helpful to share resident stories or to highlight properties when you're meeting with members of Congress. So we have pages dedicated to both on our website. Please feel free to share with us any resident stories that you'd like us to highlight. And also in the coming months, we'll be asking AHCC members to help us highlight even more properties on our websites and through our meetings. And also with any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me or Emily, or you can type them into the chat box right now, because with that, I will turn it over to Emily and we will begin our Q&A session.
Great. Well, I'd like to invite all of the other panelists back on so we can take some questions from the audience. There's some really good ones here. So let's start with a question about So one of the important lessons we've learned this year is the importance of working with residents to support them in times of stress and help them access rental subsidies. Has there been any discussion about trying to include the cost of supportive services in basis? So I'll kick us off and invite anyone to chime in. There has been some interest in this, especially from Chairman Wyden, who leads the Senate Finance Committee. If you look at the housing credit provisions that were included in the House Infrastructure Bill last year, and then a separate bill that was introduced by Senators Wyden and Cantwell, you can see there was a proposal in there to help use the housing credit to fund supportive services. And while I think everyone knows that we probably need to do a little more work to get that proposal ready to be workable, there's a lot of interest in the part of Congress in figuring out how to make that work. So that is definitely something that is under consideration, and we've got a few people from our group who are helping think through that, but want to see if anyone else wanted to add anything on that. All right, so another question we got is curious if there have been any conversations linking the AHCIA and the public housing initiatives within infrastructure separate, such as Faircloth. Seems like without the housing credit, public housing revitalization remains stuck in neutral. That is a great point of how these programs work together. And we have made the case many times, especially to members who are on some of those key committees, like the Senate Finance Committee and the House Financial Senate Banking and House Financial Services, the committees that spend a lot of time thinking about things like the rental assistance demonstration and how to revitalize HUD's housing stock, that the housing credit makes up about half the equity that goes into refinancing these projects, and it's a really crucial part. So we've definitely been having those conversations. We've also got some of the leading public housing advocacy groups like the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, Council of Large Public Housing Authorities, Public Housing Authority Directors Association, all helping out on the Action Steering Committee, the Big Tent Coalition advocating for this bill. So I think that some of those silos, we're hopefully breaking them down a bit, but also again want to invite the other panelists if anyone has anything to add on that.
Emily, if I could join in on this point, I think it's worth noting that lowering the 50% test to 25% test will help to a large extent use the housing credit in public housing recapitalization, not through RED or through other means as well. And so I think that the bond resources are a key piece of helping preserve all federally assisted housing. And to the extent that we can get those the pieces of the legislation involving bonds enacted, that will help a lot with respect to public housing.
Absolutely, and it's also worth noting that our new HUD Secretary, Marcia Fudge, is also a past sponsor or co-sponsor of the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act from when she served in Congress. So having a HUD Secretary who certainly understands the value of both the housing credit and what we're trying to do certainly bodes well for some of our agenda. So one of the other questions we wanted to ask is, are there any differences in messages that we use to advocate for the bill with Republican versus Democratic offices? So Melissa, do you want to take that one?
Sure, thanks for that. Yes and no. I mean, we always want to talk about what the AHCIA is able to do. The fact that the housing credit is responsible for virtually all of the affordable housing financed since its inception is an important point to make, as well as what it can do, what the AHCIA can do in terms of building, preserving 2 million new affordable homes, as well as an additional 3 million jobs. Now, the jobs angle really is important for Republicans in particular. We also want to frame the housing credit as an important economic growth and community development tool for rural areas, urban areas, as well as suburban areas, so nationwide. And so that's vast impact. The AHCIA will only improve that. So I think really leaning into the fact that this is an important economic growth measure. This will help stimulate the economy. Those will be important points to make for Republicans. Democrats really focusing in on the need, the fact of how this bill can help meet that need, but then also who this the credit serves, and really leaning into who is benefiting, who are the residents that this credit is enabling to have safe, affordable homes.
Yeah, I think maybe one other thing to add to that, thanks Melissa, is that, I think there's a common misconception that, affordable housing was really a blue state issue. And I think, we don't need to look very far to know that there's an affordable housing crisis and narrative happening in blue states and red states and purple states. It's everywhere and it's growing. And so I think that's an important point to make, particularly when speaking to, the Republican side of the aisle.
Yeah, I would just add too that, generally I really don't feel like there's a whole lot of different messaging I have to do to go into one office or the other. There's just so much of a shared interest that really transcends the party, I think, with this program. One thing maybe that I don't think Melissa mentioned that you might, maybe if I'm talking to a Republican office or even certain Democratic offices, there's an element of it's the private sector is kind of stepping into a role the public could alternatively do. And that's with the compliance monitoring, making that the investments you don't need the government. It's almost like a pay for success because they can't even claim the credits until the project is up and running and operating. So these are messages that maybe find some familiar ears with Republican audiences. But that's the one other thing.
Thank you for that, Matt. I totally agree. And you can also highlight how the 50% test, in fact, the newer provision can help create additional efficiencies with bond resources. So really highlighting those efficiencies that the AHCIA can provide will be important for those offices too.
And also, frankly, that it's a state-run program, right? It's a federal credit, but it's allocated by the states. They do the QAPs every year, so they're getting more. It's more of a localized kind of approach. I think that's also a good talking point.
Yeah, and I would also just add for both sides of the aisle, one of the most powerful tools we have is the list of supporters. And of course, the bill was just reintroduced last week, so we don't have that list yet of hundreds of members who've signed on yet, though you can certainly point to the list from last year. But I really feel that discussions about this bill go very differently when members or staffers see that you've got 5 other members of Congress from their state already signed on, or 50 other members from their party. It just really makes them a lot more, I think, receptive to what we're proposing. So I would encourage you to either poke around or reach out to us, and we can give you some points you might want to use to show other supporters. But members of Congress are busy, and so are staffers, and they don't necessarily have time to absorb all of the information coming their way. But if they can see other members that they know and trust and align with her on, that certainly helps. So let's see, I think we've got another question here. So one question is, do we expect the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act to get a vote? So Melissa, do you want to start there?
Sure. I will say it's probably unlikely that the AHCIA itself gets a vote, but I think it's very likely that provisions within the AHCIA will be included in one of these vehicles that does get a vote, if that helps.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a good question. We've heard variations on that. Will it get a vote? If it's so popular, why hasn't it gotten a vote? And it's really just one-off tax bills or single-issue tax bills like this one, just like Melissa said and Matt said earlier, just generally don't get a vote on their own. They sort of serve as a menu of consensus items that can go into another bigger piece of legislation. So we are laying all of that groundwork now and building up the co-sponsorship so that when they do put an infrastructure bill together, they can see that we've made the work for them easy on the housing credit by providing all of these consensus and broadly supported provisions. So I think that is it in terms of questions. If there's any final ones, enter them very quickly. But I think with that, I will thank the fellow panelists and turn it over to Megan to wrap us up.
Thanks so much, Emily. And thank you to all of our speakers today and for everybody who participated in this webinar. Please be on the lookout for an email from us that will include the webinar recording, slides, and additional information, as well as registration for our upcoming virtual fly-in. And for those of you who participated in this webinar today but are not yet members of the AHTCC, We hope you will consider joining us and helping us to advocate for the AHCIA, because as we all just talked about, right now is the time to expand and strengthen the housing credit to provide more affordable homes, and it will take all of us to build the support. Thank you all again for joining us today.
Thank you.